All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Data at Your Desk virtual workshop, Finding Data in STEM. My name is Nick Roosh. I am the STEM Data and Research Librarian here at FSU Libraries. All right, so just before we get started, we're a fairly small group today. I encourage you, if you have questions throughout the presentation, to go ahead and enter them in the Zoom chat or raise your hand. Emily will be here monitoring the chat and the participants window in case we have any questions. As we're getting started, I'd love it if everyone wouldn't mind either in the chat or doing it verbally. If you could maybe kind of put in either what your major is or what department you're from on campus and kind of what drew you to today's workshop. It'll help as we're going along. So while y'all are doing that, I'll just give a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're first going to start off with some definitions, just to sort of orient ourselves to the material that we'll be going over. We'll talk about some places to find data, such as in data repositories and databases, data associated with publications. We'll also talk about some questions to ask about data and some things to look out for when you find data in databases. All right, so to start off, we have some definitions. So first, when we say data, what do we mean by that? There are many different definitions of data. If I was to ask 10 people in a room or everybody in this room today, what their definition of data was, I'd get 10 different responses. I'd get a different response from every person. If you do a Google search for just data, you're going to find a lot of different definitions. And that's because data differs depending on what context you're in, what discipline that you're in, what type of research project that you're doing. For today's workshop, I'm going to give a more general definition, and then I'm going to talk about research data, because that's what we'll be looking for today. So the dictionary definition of data is facts and statistics collected together for reference and analysis. Put more simply, data can be considered pieces of information. So data by itself has no meaning. Right, so if you have just a spreadsheet with a bunch of values on it, a bunch of numbers or text, by itself, they're just pieces of information, right? They don't have any sort of meaning. Data only has some sort of meaning and is really considered data once it's been analyzed or used to make calculations or draw conclusions, or to tell some sort of a story. And more specifically, if we think about research data, there's a lot of different definitions of this as well, depending on what discipline that you're in, whether you're in sciences, social sciences, humanities. But for today's material, when we think about research data, we're going to use this definition from the Code of Federal Regulations. And this states that research data is the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. And I know it says scientific community, and we're talking about STEM today, so this is appropriate, but this can really mean the research community, right? So anybody that's doing research and is collecting any sort of data, whether that's quantitative data or qualitative data, this definition really applies. Data is really used to validate research findings and to lend them authenticity and integrity. So some examples of research data. So the ones on the left are pretty obvious when we think about research data. So documentation, spreadsheets, like I mentioned earlier. So if you have an Excel sheet or something in another spreadsheet program, audio or videotapes, photographs or films. So if you have images, that is considered data. If you have scripts or any sort of code, those are pretty obvious when we think about research data and are typically what people will think of if you ask them for some examples. Some not so obvious examples of data are a lot of things that we use throughout the research process that maybe we were used to record information, to record our raw values, but maybe we don't, publish that as part of the final data set. But it's really important, and it's considered data because that documentation is important to interpreting that data. Whether that's data itself or whether it also can be considered metadata, which is sort of information about the data set itself. So some not so obvious examples are things like lab notebooks, whether that's paper lab notebooks or electronic, field notes, questionnaires, survey instruments, code books, and data dictionaries, and then like methodologies. So if we're thinking about, the methodology write-up for an experiment or standard operating procedures and protocols, you're going to find a lot of really, really useful data and information from this. So these are some things to look out for as well when you're looking for data on your topic in a research field. We have sort of the obvious, but it's also important to keep in mind those other types of data as well. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about where do we encounter data. So we've talked about what data is. Now the next question is, where do we encounter it? And I've put a few examples on the screen. And this goes for both STEM data and non-STEM data. So this really goes for any type of data that you're looking at, as do a lot of the other sort of best practices that we'll talk about today. So probably if you're in a university setting, if you're in a research or a lab setting, some of the most obvious places might be like journal articles, peer-reviewed publications, theses and dissertations, those sort of things. But you also encounter data in a lot of other places too, that you may not even think about. So like the news, on social media. So we've seen a lot recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. We see a lot of graphs and charts and infographics and different pieces of data that are disseminated through these different avenues. So you'll find a lot of different pieces of data there. Mobile apps and television kind of going along with the news and social media. GPS, so those maps that we all use to, get around town or give us directions to, the store or a new place that we're going. That also is a form of data and takes advantage of, geographic data that's been collected. But when we're thinking about these different sources for where we encounter the data, there's a little bit of a caveat. So the data that you'll see from many of the sources that I just mentioned is sort of the final version of that data, right? So that data has already been collected, it's been analyzed, and it's been summarized by someone, right? Whether that's the original researcher that collected the data, whether that's a news reporter, whether that's a statistician, somebody's already put that data into a final form. And when you're thinking about how that's presented, everyone sort of has a purpose when they're presenting data in a certain way, right? They're sort of telling a story, kind of, going back to what we talked about earlier, saying that data is really only has meaning when it's been, collected, it's been analyzed, and it's telling a story. And this is true both for data that you'll see in the news, on, out in the general public, and it's also true in journal articles. So if you've ever looked at a peer-reviewed article before and you see all the different figures and graphs and tables that are in those often really only show you the sort of final results of an analysis or a summary of the analysis. It sort of highlights the key points that the researcher, the author of the article is trying to present to you. Right, so it doesn't usually include right there in the paper due to space limitations of a journal, and just because sometimes there's tons of it, doesn't really show you the raw or original data that was collected on instruments in the field by the researcher. But in order to verify the accuracy of the data or to reproduce that data in your own experiments later on, it's really important that you're able to find the original source of that data, to find that raw data or original data, to see what the researcher collected, so that you can independently verify whether that final representation is accurate and whether it's being presented in a coherent way, and to sort of evaluate it for yourself. All right, so we've gotten to that point. I'll just stop for a second, see if everyone's with me so far, if anybody has any questions. And for those of you that came in a few minutes late, feel free to enter any questions or comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll respond to them. All right, if there's no questions, I will go ahead and continue. So now I want to talk a little bit about where we can find that original data. I just mentioned the importance of being able to find the source of the data, the raw data. But where can we find that? Where can we find data sets in general, right? Which is sort of the topic of today's session. Well, there's really a couple of different places where we can find that original data, sort of broadly speaking. So we can find it in something called a data repository, which is a site, kind of like a database, but specifically for data, where researchers can house their data sets. And these are often divided up by discipline. There's a lot of different discipline-specific data repositories, and I'll show you how to find some of those for different research topics here in a few minutes. There's also institutional repositories, so a lot of different universities have a repository not only for depositing like theses and dissertations, but also for depositing data sets that have been created by researchers at their institution. And I'll talk about ours in just a couple of minutes. You also can find data associated with publications in databases and journals. So a lot of your databases that you might use through like the library's website that you'd use to find journal articles and different journals for your research, a lot of them are now have the ability for you to filter by articles that have data associated with them. So you'll see this as like associated data or just data sometimes in general. And we'll show a couple examples of that. Not all databases have this at this point, but more and more of them are starting to put this as an option. Supporting information is another way that you can find data associated with journal articles. This is probably one of the more traditional ways that you'll see in fields like chemistry or American Chemical Society journals to place, all of that raw data that they can't fit in like a 3 or 4 page publication. You'll see it as like supporting information that's associated with the article. And then I mentioned earlier, like theses and dissertations. Some of these, parts of these sometimes get turned into publications, but sometimes they just live in an institutional repository or as part of like the ProQuest theses and dissertation site. This is also a good place to find some original or raw data that you might not otherwise find in other databases or data repositories. And the reason that finding the original data is important, and there's growing numbers of ways to find this data, is really both transparency and openness of data and the research enterprise, right? So if more researchers can access data, it really helps with reproducibility and other researchers being able to reproduce that data. It helps them increase their number of citations as well. If somebody finds your original data set, whether that's even just a spreadsheet, or if it's a methodology that they might adapt for their own use, your work is going to get attributed more. So these open data sort of movement has really led to an uptick in the number of repositories and databases and journals supporting more open availability of data. So the first we'll talk about is a data repository. So as I said, these allow researchers to preserve data in a way that meets funder requirements. So a lot of different funding agencies that fund research grants for researchers, both on university campuses and in private industry, are requiring researchers to deposit their data in a way that's findable, that's accessible to the widest audience possible, that's interoperable, so it's saved in a variety of file formats that can be read by different computer programs and software, that it's reproducible. And as I mentioned as well, citation and linking aspect is also important. So how do you find a data repository, right? I mentioned there's a lot of them out there. We can't possibly know all of them. I myself work with a lot of researchers in finding a place to deposit their data, and I don't even know what all of them are. New ones are springing up all the time. So there's discipline, institutional, and national repositories. So the discipline-specific repositories, you can find those by going to this site called Re3Data, which I will use for my examples that I'll show in a second. We also have an institutional repository here at Florida State University called DigiNull. That's used, it's been used traditionally for theses and dissertations, which I said will have some data in them, but it's also been used in some disciplines for data set deposition as well. And then there's also a third category, national repositories. So data.gov, you may have come across before. That's really used for researchers at like national labs or researchers that are associated with the different funding institutions. So like if somebody works at a National Institutes of Health lab or a National Science Foundation lab, this is a way for them internally to meet those data sharing requirements, and data can be accessed by the public. All right, so I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint for just a second, and I'm going to go through to Re3 data. So Re3 data is also known as the Registry of Research Data Repositories. And this is a site maintained by data professionals, those in the data library community, folks at DataCite. And it's really a place, landing place to come to find an appropriate repository for research data. But we can also use it to find data, right? If we're looking for data in our particular discipline or our particular research project, we can use this site to find that data. And to do that, let's say we go up here to browse. And let's say we just know like a particular subject, we work in a particular area, and we want to find data that's related to our project, but we don't know which repository or which place to start. So if we go up to browse and we click browse by subject here on Re3 data, you'll see that it comes up with this really awesome color wheel. And I absolutely love this color wheel. It's both, to me, it's visually appealing, but it also provides you a nice way to sort of go from sort of a broad macro-disciplinary level and really narrow down what kind of repositories that you're looking for. So for today's example, let's say that we're in the life sciences, right? So if we're a life sciences researcher or life sciences student, we're looking for data in that area, and we're in medicine. So say we're a researcher broadly within the medicine field. And then you can see we've gone here. This color wheel kind of keeps, closing in and getting narrower and narrower. The sort of outer categories that were all really small before are kind of expanding. And then we can say go to microbiology, virology, and immunology. And then once we get to here, where there's just that inner part of the wheel and then this final part, once we click here, it should bring us to a search results page that meets all of our criteria. So let's go to microbial ecology and applied microbiology. So if we do a search here, now you'll see we're on a search results page. And this gives us all of the different data repositories that meet our search criteria, right? And so now you can go through, you can take a look at, some basic information about each of them. You can look at their content types, what country that they're based in, what subjects they apply to, and see which one of these fits your criteria the best. For my example, I'm going to go to Dryad. Dryad is a very generalist repository for like biomedical scientific literature, particularly data for which there isn't a more specialized repository. So you'll see a lot of biology, kind of biochemistry, biomedical sciences data deposited in Dryad. So it's really a good place to start in general. And you'll see on here, there's persistent identifiers to the repository. Some of them will provide a repository size. You can see Dryad is pretty comprehensive. There's over 30,000 data sets on here. They call them data packages on Dryad. And then you'll see there's a persistent link to the repository itself. So if we click on that, that will take us to the repository. Now, in this example, you don't necessarily have to go through the Read3 data site. If you know that you're looking for Dryad, you can do a Google search for Dryad or Data Dryad, and you can also get to the site here. This is open source, openly available. You know, it's a community resource, so you can get to it that way as well. All right, so let's say that we're a researcher in the life sciences, and we're looking for research on COVID-19, right? We want to find a data set on COVID-19. So we can do a search up here in the search bar. This is the basic search within Dryad. And you'll see that each of these data repositories is a little bit different in how you navigate to the data and the data sets. Let's say we find this second one interesting. So the scale and dynamics of COVID-19 epidemics across Europe. And then we click on that. And now this brings us to the record page. And you'll see this on most data repositories. It'll look a little bit different. Every one of them has their own style. But you'll find a lot of this basic information on here. You'll find like the author and citation information. You'll find the publication date or the date that the data was deposited in the repository, which can be really important if you're looking for more recent data, data within the last 5 years or something of that nature. You'll see a persistent identifier or a DOI, digital object identifier, for the data set. So whenever someone deposits data in one of these repositories, it gets its own identifier, right? You think of publications or journals, articles that have DOIs. Well, the data sets also have their own DOI. And sometimes it's actually different than the publication itself. But you can link to an associated publication within these repositories. You'll see if we scroll down, there's a method section. So this is how the data was collected, the data was analyzed, what models that they used, what their sources were for their particular data. So if you want to go even further back and find their original sources for the data, they provide the links here, which is really, really awesome. So you can, do as much diving into this data as possible. It tells you the funding source, so where this was done. So it was done at the University of Oxford. Then up here, which is probably what most people are looking for when they're going to the repository, is the data files themselves. So if you click on the date here, you'll see the different data sets that are available. And you can download these data sets and then use them for your own analysis. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at your data files is what file format are those saved in? What program could you use to open this? So you'll see this is in like XLSX, so like a Microsoft format. So you would have to use that or something that could read those to open that data. But that's really important to keep in mind as well. But you can either download one of these files by just clicking on it directly, or you can download the entire data set. All right. Is everyone still with me so far? Does anyone have any questions? All right, if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and move on to another example of a repository. So the next repository that I want to talk about, I'm going to go directly to. I already have that open in the interest of time. And this is the Cambridge Structural Database. So this is a repository for crystal structure data of various chemical compounds. And just a little bit of background in case you're not as knowledgeable or aren't a chemistry or physics or biology researcher. A crystal structure very simply represents a structure in three-dimensional space. So if you see those sort of ball and stick models in a journal article, or if you ever took organic chemistry and you work with those, those came from a crystal structure that a researcher collected. And the Cambridge Structural Database is a repository for that data. You can see on the screen, it was established in 1965. This is one of, if not the oldest publicly available data repositories. It's been around for a long time. So it's, very well maintained. It has a really great community behind it. It's used by researchers in chemistry, biology, physics, and related fields as well. And there's over 1 million structures in this repository. So there's a lot of information here. You can do simple searches for crystal structure data for compounds that you might be looking for if you're in this area or if you're interested, or for a class project as well. And to access the data here, if we go to community and you go down to this third button, access structures, you'll see that we come up to a simple search page. And you'll see that this one's a little bit different than what we saw in Dryad, right? And so that is a consequence of, a different discipline, different type of data that we're looking for. So researchers in this area have different data or different information that they expect. So this repository sort of reflects that. And you can search here by any one of these fields. You can fill in more than one field. You can look in their entire published collection or in subsets. We're just going to look in their entire collection. Say we want to look for compounds related to caffeine, right? So in our coffee and our tea, really important in the morning at this time of the day. So if we do a search here and we wait just a second while it's doing search results, now you can see the search results page. And you can see this looks a lot different than what we saw in Dryad as well. I'm not going to go into all of the different, what the data means. That's not really the topic of today's session. And but if we click on one of the records, right, so we can do that just like we did in Dryad, you'll see this is how they have their data laid out. And see, they also have a data citation. So they have the authors, what year that it was published. They have a digital object identifier for their data. They have a data deposition date. There's an associated publication with this as well, and it has its own digital object identifier. Then it has some chemical structure data information as well, and this really cool 3D viewer that you can actually play around with. So it's super fun. But you can see this is, it has some of the same information as we saw in our Dryad example, but it's laid out a little bit differently, and there's different pieces of data, based on that particular discipline. But these are just two different examples of data repositories. If you want to play around with this a little bit more, I highly recommend going to Re3 Data, going to the browse by subject, looking in your subject area for different repositories that might be out there that might be appropriate for your data, whether you want to deposit it somewhere, whether you're looking for it for a project. And if you know the name of a repository, if you know, like say you knew what Dryad was, or the Cambridge Structural Database, you could type that right in and search for it here as well. All right, so I have a few slides on here. just sort of talking about those. And let me see, we have something in the chat. So yes, so in most repositories, the data sets are openly available. In Dryad, all of these are openly available. You see they even have a public domain license, which means you can freely share this. On the Cambridge Structural Database, this simple search, which is essentially, a whole search of their database and information, their repository. All of those are openly available. You can download those data sets as well. So a lot of the data sets are openly available. And if you're looking, sometimes the publications might be in a paid journal, but usually the data sets themselves you can download and use. That's one thing to keep in mind, is if you look at sort of the license and sharing information for a data set, there'll usually be something that says, how you can share this data, how you should attribute that data. If you're, using it yourself in like a presentation or that sort of thing. Great question. I hope this helps. So if we think about what's in a repository, right, what we just talked about, some considerations, as I've mentioned earlier, and things to look out for, things that you'll find with most data sets, whether there's some sort of an identifier or citation information, a description of the data set, so saying what the data set is, what project it is, what's contained in the data set. Is it qualitative or quantitative data? Their methodology, how did they analyze it? What software did they use to analyze it? Is the data in a proprietary file format that you would need that specific software to open that file, or is it in a more like open, non-proprietary format, like a text file or a CSV file? Is there associated documentation? Is there like a README file or a code book or something that describes the data that they're using? In that Dryad example, it pointed back to, data that they used to do some analysis. So they looked like they were doing some secondary data analysis. So they pointed back to another original data set. So that's kind of a unique way of doing it. And then a link to an original publication, if there is one. Some data repositories just allow you to deposit data before there's a publication or without a publication. So sometimes you won't see an associated publication. This is especially true in like an institutional repository where like researchers on campus might be doing a project. They want to make the data publicly available, open access, but they may not be doing a paper on that. So they might make that data openly available without a publication. But if there is an associated publication, you'll usually see that on the repository itself. All right. So I'm going to stay in this view because I'm going to go back to some examples in a second. But with this slide, I'm actually going to show it because we're going to need that. So we've talked a little bit about data repositories, right? So that's one place to sort of find your data. Another place are databases and journals themselves. So within a repository, you can link back to an original publication, right? Where like the final data or the summarized or worked up data might be. So you can actually do the converse as well. Many databases now provide the ability to link articles with associated data and filter for this when you're doing a search. Links to that data source are often found, within the record page when you've done a search in a database. And you can usually either view it depending on the database. So they're all sort of a little different with this, since it's still kind of a new thing. Some of them you can view within the database itself if it has the ability to do that, or it'll link you out to like a data repository or something we've already talked about. So this first example on the right is from the database PubMed, and I'll show you how get these in a second, but that was sort of the initial filters, and then this would be sort of at the bottom of the record page. Get out here. So to get to this database, I'm going to do this the same way I would show folks if I was just talking about databases in general and how to find journal articles. We're going to go to the library website. So it authenticates and knows who I am. And we're going to go to PubMed. So PubMed is a database some of you might have used before or seen this. It's a database from the National Library of Medicine that contains research from biomedical literature, life sciences research primarily. But if we want to do a search in here, I'm going to go to the advanced search. And say that I'm a researcher that's doing, research on like vitamin D deficiency, and maybe supplements, work with that. So if I want to do this, I'm going to just write in my search, and I won't go too much into, writing a search string and all that. That's for a whole nother workshop. Let's say we here and we can spell correctly. That's important. All right, and so let's say we do a search in our database. If we look over here on the left-hand side, you'll see one of our filters is associated data. So what this will do is it will take our search results and it's going to look for articles that have a data set associated with them, and then just give us those articles. So if you're looking in a database, you're searching for articles, but you also are looking for data at the same time, this can be sort of a way to find both sets of information. So if we look and click on associated data, you see it applies that filter. Our search results are much less. And that doesn't mean for those other articles that there isn't data out there available for them. It's just not necessarily linked between like the publication and this database or an associated repository. But you're seeing more and more of them kind of as time goes on, especially for newer articles. So let's try this second article. So if you see here, we have a very standard record that you would see in a database. If we scroll down, you'll see down here at the bottom, we have associated data. So it's kind of this little section down here at the end. I don't know why a lot of these databases are putting it all the way down at the bottom, but it's kind of how it is. But you'll see if we click on this, it's in this sort of repository or site called clinicaltrials.gov. You can view this data in either PubMed or clinicaltrials.gov. So let's try this. All right, and I have a dark reader on here, so I'll make this a little bit lighter so we can see it. But you'll see this takes us to clinicaltrial.gov, which is also through the National Library of Medicine. And this is our data set. So you can see this page has a lot of information about the data. There's a description. They talk about their study design, which gets into that methodology that we talked about earlier. So that's really important. There's, submission date for this. There's completion date for the data collection. You can see there's all kinds of information here. There's a couple of associated publications here. So there's a lot of information here. They even tell you how to read a study record, which is really interesting. So that's finding data in PubMed. So that's one example of a database. It gives you the author information, the responsible party. So if you want to follow up with the researchers, if you have questions about it, questions about their data, you can do that as well. All right. So now I'm going to show one other example of a database. And like I said, there's quite a few databases that are starting to do this. We don't have time to go through all of them. But these are a couple of representative examples in STEM. You can use these same strategies if you're in the social sciences or humanities, or if you're doing research in those areas. All right, so the second database example that I'm going to show is Web of Science. And Web of Science is a very general database for the sciences and for STEM researchers that pulls journal articles and collections from a wide variety of journals. So if you've done research in STEM or you're doing research in STEM, you might have used or will be using Web of Science. All right, and so let's say here we're just going to use the basic search. So we're just trying to find data here. Let's say we're looking for data on the migration patterns of birds. I know I came up with really, really random examples for this. Normally I do something with coffee and tea and caffeine, so I'm going to go a little bit different for this time. So if we do a search for this area, we'll see here on the, now we have our search results page, and we'll see here on our left-hand side, we have, again, this little associated data filter. And it has this little, symbol that's sometimes used for, just data in general. So if we check associated data and we hit refine, now this is going to come up with articles that have associated data with them that are in the database. And you'll see they all have this little associated data symbol with them here in Web of Science. So that's really nice. Sort of, indicates to you, again, that there is data with this. Let's say we click on this article from Functional Ecology. You can see up here, if we click on associated data, this takes us right down to it. So again, it's about halfway down the page. You'll see here, there's actually multiple sets of data. And this can be any associated data. So as part of some research, you're going to be creating code or creating a software program. You're going to find that here, or a link to a source for that. And then here's data study that's been done on this research. So there's a link to an external source to download this data. So if we click this, this will take us out of Web of Science or out of whatever database that you're in. And it'll take you into the data repository that this data is deposited in. So here it's in this MoveBank data repository for animal tracking data. And you'll see this again has like abstract, identifier information, and then the different data sets and a place where you can download these. And again, this looks like these are open access. You'll see this looks like it says CC0, which is a Creative Commons license. which means that this data is openly available. And you can use this for your own research and analysis. So this is a really nice, really nice feature. If we click on this other data set, I believe this is also in the same repository. And you'll see here, this actually gives you citations for both the original article and the data. So you can cite both the article and the data set, or just one if you would be using these in your own research. You can download each of the individual data files as well. All right, let's see, when I say software, where this takes me to. All right, so this is, if I get out of this, lighten it up a little bit. So this takes you to a spot where there's some information about the software, and then some places to download that as well. All right, and so there's some slides on here, some screenshots. If you want to go back and take a look at those later. We'll go back into the presentation. Before I go on to the last part, we'll just pause here a second, see if everyone is still with me, if anyone has any questions on anything I've talked about so far. If not, we'll go ahead and continue. All right, so finding data at FSU libraries. So you saw a little bit of getting to the databases to find data through the libraries, resources that we have access to. But there are lots of ways, if you use the library website or you're using resources, that you can find primary and secondary data for your research. You can find this through our research guides, through the databases tab. If we go back to the FSU Libraries website, and if you look under databases and you do databases by type, we actually have a category for data sets and statistics. So these will take you to some websites that might have data with them. Now, some of these are going to be just databases like ACS Publications has, and a lot of these are probably going to be, databases, but some of them might have just data or just statistics, right? So like the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, this is a social sciences data repository. That since we were focusing on STEM, we didn't talk about too much today. This is also another major data repository and place to find data, especially if you're doing research in those areas. So it's going to cover some of the major repositories and databases. It obviously doesn't have all of them, but these are some of the ones that are commonly used, we have available through the libraries. Obviously, Read3 Data is a really good place for all of the different discipline-specific repositories that are out there. And then also your friendly librarians. So I work with a lot of researchers, helping them find data for their projects, for their research studies. So if after you leave today's talk, if you have other questions that you didn't think of during the session today, and you have specific project questions, I'm more than happy to help with that. And so we'll just sort of finish up. Those are some Some of the major ways that you can find data, obviously there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of repositories, a lot of different websites that have data. We wouldn't be able to cover all of them in just, an hour-long presentation. But I wanted to finish up with some questions to ask when you're thinking about data. And this goes for the raw data or like a final piece of data that you might see in a publication or like on social media somewhere. It's always important to ask like who's collecting the data. Is it a researcher at an academic institution? Is it someone in a private company? Is it a government agency? Who's collecting that data? Which you'll be able to find in that data citation information, or it'll sometimes be if you're looking at like a figure in like a news article or something, it should be below that figure. For what purpose are they acquiring this data? Is it basic research into a particular area? Are they just collecting like new chemical information, new information about a disease? For what purpose are they acquiring the data? One that we didn't talk about too much, but I think I pointed out on the Dryad page, who's funding the data collection. Is it a government agency like the National Science Foundation that's sort of funding this for the public interest and sort of further research and development? Is it a private company that's maybe doing a study on a new compound or a new drug that they've invented? Who's funding this? That is sometimes important. How large is the sample size? When you're doing an analysis, what is the end goal of the data? And how's that data being disseminated? So is it openly available? Is it accessible? Can other researchers find the data, reproduce it, kind of use it for their own analysis? Where's that located? And is in a place that's findable. So that's really all that I have today. Thank you so much for your attention.